I'm back with a review of Thomas Sowell's Black Rednecks and White Liberals. In this video I'm going to talk about chapter 3, which is titled The Real History of Slavery. This is probably the most controversial and provocative part of the whole book. In this chapter, Sowell basically argues in favor of European moral superiority over the rest of the world. He argues that despite slavery existing in every part of the world throughout history, only one civilization developed a moral apprehension against the practice, and that is Western civilization. I'm going to show how fallacious his argument is. I have a lot to say, so this video is probably going to be a long one. Bear with me. While slavery was common to all civilizations, as well as to peoples considered uncivilized, only one civilization developed a moral revulsion against it, very late in its history: Western civilization. No non-Western nation or civilization shared this animosity towards slavery that began to develop in the Western world in the late 18th century, reached its peak in the 19th century. In short, what was so patently wrong about slavery in the eyes of Western civilization of the past 2 centuries was almost incomprehensible to many non-Westerners. So, how accurate is that claim? When up against careful scrutiny, that claim falls apart. I'll just mention a few instances. As early as 1470, before the transatlantic slave trade even begun, formerly enslaved Africans in Seville, Spain, these were Africans who were victimized by the Iberian slave trade, set up an organization, a confraternity called Casa de los Negros, translating to the House of the Blacks, a kind of religious charity set up by Catholic former enslaved Africans. The main mission of this charity was to purchase the freedom of other Africans victimized by slavery and also supports them. It is hard to argue that these actions had no moral inclinations inspiring them. The House of the Blacks in Spain was probably the earliest example of Pan-African solidarity. Mind you, these were Africans from all over Africa. Their shared experience of slavery had made them develop a kind of brotherhood, which is reflected in the name of the charity. In 1526, the King of Congo, Alfonso I, otherwise known as Nzenga Mbemba, wrote a letter to the Portuguese king complaining about slavers being sent to his kingdom. He told the Portuguese king that he wanted masons, teachers, priests, and other skilled individuals to help him build his kingdom. Instead, he was being sent human traffickers who were stealing his people away. Again, clearly moral apprehension from the side of Africans. In 1526, mind you. In 1720, during the transatlantic slave trade, the Baga people of modern-day Guinea staged a revolt with the aim of stopping the slave trade and slavery. The rebellion was inspired and led by a man called Tompa, who was formerly enslaved himself. Once he got back to his people, he informed them about the horrors of slavery and set up an army to wage a war against European slavers and their African collaborators. His army went about attacking slave forts, unaliving collaborators, unaliving European slave traders. They did all they could to bring an end to the slave trade. Europeans, in conjunction with their African collaborators, were able to defeat Tomba and his people, and the slave trade continued to flourish. Tomba was arrested and executed by the French. In the 1730s, in what is now known as modern-day southeastern Nigeria, there existed a group called the Bloodmen. These Bloodmen tried to put an end to the slave trade, like the Baga people of Guinea. They went about assassinating local slave traders and also European slave traders. Mind you, these are just a few examples of the many instances of resistance on the African continent. Most of Africa did not record history through writing. Mr. Sowell is fully aware of that, and he uses the absence of written records to somehow claim moral apprehensions to slavery did not exist in Africa. So the efforts of the Baga people of Guinea, the bloodmen of Old Calabar, were all useless because they didn't put down their revulsion to slavery on paper. Never mind the fact that they literally risked their life to put an end to slavery. Themselves the leading slave traders of the 18th century, Europeans nevertheless became, in the 19th century, the destroyers of slavery around the world, not just in European societies or European offshoot societies overseas, but in non-European societies as well, over the bitter opposition of Africans, Arabs, Asians, and others, so that it was essentially European imperialism which ended slavery. This idea might seem shocking, not because it does not fit the facts, but because it does not fit the prevailing visions of our time. Mr. Sowell conveniently ignores the systems of slavery and forced labor Europeans established when they invaded Africa. The slavery in King Leopold's Congo, which had everything that New World slavery had, maybe bar the dreaded Middle Passage. The Germans, they too enslaved the Nama and Herero people of Namibia. The British stamped out slavery not only throughout the British Empire, which included 1/4 of the world, whether measured in land or people. The British are basically the heroes of this chapter. What he doesn't want to tell you is that they introduced various forms of forced labor in Kenya. After stealing the Kenyan land at gunpoint, they then tried to recreate the dynamics of slavery in the New World. White masters, black labor. Although the slavery might not have been as overt as the one practiced by the Belgians in Congo, the natives were forced to pay tax, and the only way they could afford to pay that tax was through working for these white masters.
Kwandika kwa mushara matekwaririria na mundu angiraga wira akathia kogwa ni athungu.
To add some extra spice, some British settlers even tried to force the natives to call them master.
If you did not call a settler Bwana, you have committed a crime, and you are allowed to be put in prison for that reason. And therefore I said, no, this is not to continue.
Isn't that wonderful? Once decolonization came, the British then decided to compensate those white settlers. Mind you, this is for stolen land in which they had no claim over, land in which the Kenyans were not compensated for, but the British did not see any need to compensate them. Instead, the white settlers, who had already generated a lot of money from those stolen lands at the expense of forced black labor. Just as how they saw nothing wrong with compensating slave masters and giving slaves nothing, they saw nothing wrong with compensating the settlers and giving the Kenyan natives nothing. Naturally, after being impoverished, the Kenyan natives were not able to buy back their land. The land was then stolen again by the Kenyan elite, people like Jomo Kenyatta, a man who ironically is famous for his quote. The man who is known for that exact quote turned out to be a pathetic little land thief himself. The victims of that land theft never got their land back. On this issue, it was essentially Western civilization against the world. At the time, Western civilization had the power to prevail against all other civilizations. That is how and why slavery was destroyed as an institution in almost the whole world. Now, let's look at actual history instead of Eurocentric fantasies. It's funny how in this whole chapter, Mr. Sowell never deemed it fit to speak about resistance of the enslaved and the role in which it played in abolition. He presents abolition as some sort of gift from white people to Africans. He never talks about how enslaved Africans freed themselves. Between 1791 and 1804, enslaved Africans in Haiti staged a rebellion. They defeated the French, the British, the Spanish, and they freed themselves from slavery. After defeating the French and Napoleon in 1803, In 1804, they declared themselves independent and abolished slavery forever. He references the Haitian Revolution like 3 times in this chapter, and each time it's in a negative light. He describes the Haitian Revolution each time as a bloodbath and fails to even mention that that revolution led to the abolition of slavery long before morally superior Britain or America did. After gaining their independence, the Haitians did something pretty remarkable. In 1815, Simon Bolivar headed to Haiti to seek assistance for his war against the Spanish to liberate Latin America. He visited Haiti to ask for financial and military support, and the Haitian president, Alexander Petion, gave him the assistance with the condition that he would free every enslaved person in the lands he liberated. So these are formerly enslaved Africans who were by no means rich. They had very limited resources, but they still gave some of their limited resources for the sake of abolition. Mr. Sowell does not see any of this as worthy of praise, but the British, after getting filthy rich off slavery and paying slave masters, apparently deserve praise. When the threat of being boarded seemed imminent, the Arabs would throw slaves overboard to drown, rather than have them be found on board, which would lead to the British seizure of the vessels and punishment for those who manned it. The worst that could befall the slaves was when the slaver was overhauled by a British cruiser, and they might have been flung overboard to dispose of all evidence. Devereux mentions a case where Arabs, when pursued by an English cruiser, cut the throats of 20 slaves and threw them overboard. Colum also states the Arabs would not hesitate to knock slaves on the head and throw them overboard to avoid capture. This description of Arab barbarity bears a very striking resemblance to the Zong massacre. In 1781, a British slave ship called Zong ran into some difficulties, and the white crew members made the decision to intentionally drown over 100 enslaved Africans so they could later claim insurance. But the insurance company refused to pay because they claimed they had intentionally discarded their goods, quote unquote, so they had no claim. This spiraled into a long legal dispute. Then abolitionists came into the fold and argued that the crew members should be charged with murder. The judge ruled in the favor of the crew members and stated the following: "What is this claim that human people have been thrown overboard? This is a case of chattel or goods. Blacks are goods and property. It is madness to accuse these well-serving, honorable men of murder. The case is the same as if wood had been thrown overboard." We mustn't forget the extreme dehumanization Africans were victimized by both Europeans in the transatlantic slave trade and by Arabs. One woman was brought out of the dhow with a month-old infant in her arms. The baby's forehead was crushed, and when she was asked how the injury had happened, she explained to the ship's interpreter that as the boat came alongside, the baby began to cry. One of the dhow men, fearing that the sailors would hear the cries, picked up a stone and crushed the child's head. Sowell talks about the brutality of Arab slavers towards Africans. This is something that is not spoken about as much as it needs to be spoken about, especially as it caused devastation to so many people in Africa. The Sudanese, East Africans, they suffered a lot. Many times that the Arab slave trade is invoked is usually done by people trying to diminish the barbarity of the transatlantic slave trade. So you always have to be careful. But nevertheless, it's a historical fact. These anti-black sentiments still exist in the Arab world to this very day. And in the past, these sentiments were promoted by some of the Arab world's greatest thinkers, the likes of Ibn Khaldun, who once said Africans were similar to dumb animals and as such were naturally suited to be slaves. Despite the impression created by roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at the time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coast of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crew of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. Even by Mr. Sowell's standards, this part was especially monstrous. He's comparing people that were literally enslaved, forced to be there, people that were beat, tortured, sexually assaulted by these crew members who chose to be there. He's comparing their death rates as if to say both of them suffered equally. And of course, focusing on the death rates and not the actual numbers was very intentional. He was fully aware that there was a huge numbers disparity between the enslaved Africans and the crew members. So let's say, for example, 30% of crew members died. It might just have been like 30 people, but if 30% of the enslaved on those voyages died, it would have been hundreds. I'll sum up this chapter by saying it was at best incomplete, at worst propagandistic.